Henoch's Prophecies.
Presented by Quetzal, Contact Report 215, Saturday, February 28, 1987, 2:09 a.m.
Before I explain Enoch's prophecies, I would like to point out that prophecies are always changeable and can be changed for the better. If the human beings make positive changes in their thoughts, feelings, and actions, which lead to that which is better and positively progressive. Prophecies are always based on certain causes from which, in turn, certain effects result, while these effects can be changed at any time, however, if the preceding causes have already changed in their form. Therefore, it is possible that negative or evil prophecies never have to be fulfilled. If the preceding causes are purposively changed to the positive in a wise that something positive and good results therefrom, instead of something negative and evil terrible. However, this does not apply to predictions, because they are based on unchangeable happenings, which will occur in the future with absolute surety and certainty. Predictions are based on a preview and thus on a direct viewing of the future, which neither has anything to do with a prophecy nor with a probability calculation. Therefore, if I make known to you a part of Enoch's prophecies for the third millennium, then it does not mean that these must actually fulfill themselves, because, in any case, the precondition for their fulfillment would be that the already existing causes, as also the future causes, would continue and be created so that a fulfillment of the prophecies can occur. Thus, the possibility always exists, always provided that the human being of Earth becomes rational, that everything changes toward the good, the better, and the positive by means of a rational rethinking, as well as through a rational development of feelings and an equally rational acting, wherethrough the prophecies do not have to fulfill themselves. However, if this developmental change does not occur, then a very terrible, evil, and negative time is in store for the Earth and its entire population in the coming new millennium.
Since the last, thus the second, actually the Third World War, very much has changed for the positive and good in terms of the thoughts, feelings, and actions of the human being of Earth. But in my opinion, all that is not enough because the great developmental change for the better has not been worked out yet. Indeed, neither by the mightful ones of this world nor by the entire humankind of Earth. During the past years, you have made many predictions and probability calculations, and also mentioned prophetic facts regarding the terrestrial economic, military, political, and religious sectarian situation, in which case I was requested to spread this information, which I have also done. Both governments as well as newspapers and radio stations were informed by me, but also TV stations and many private persons worldwide. However, all of that availed to nothing because, up to now, the human beings have muddled along in the old style, and have not given a cold brass farthing about the prophecies, predictions, and probability calculations. And precisely that will probably also continue to be the case when, in the coming times, I spread Enoch's prophecies for the third millennium, if I receive the permission from you to do so. But nevertheless, I find that Enoch's message for the future must be made known and must be spread, because perhaps it will bear good fruit after all.
You never seem to give up your hopes. Your optimism is honorable and deserves to be heard by the human beings. But seeing how things are shaping up so far in this century, there is not too much hope that the human being of Earth will come to his or her senses and listen to your words. This will only be the case when the prophecies begin to fulfill themselves, or even only after they have already been fulfilled. Probably only then will the time come, when the calumnies and defamations against you will find an end with regard to you maintaining contacts with us, which, for a long time, will continue to be vehemently denied by your enemies as well as by pathological know-it-alls and critics who dismiss the contacts as swindle, lies, and deception. But the distant future will prove the full truth about our contacts with you, and then the human beings will also accept the help which we offer through you, even if they erroneously assume that we come from the seven-star system known to the Earth's human being as the Pleiades.
Sim, Ya, Say, and Pa have already explained that to me. But let us hear now what the new millennium will bring to the human beings of Earth and the planet Earth according to Enoch's prophecies.
I will do that shortly, but I would like to explain beforehand that I am not authorized to give precise dates in an official form.
I see, but it's probably quite good in such a way. However, I would be grateful if, for the better understanding of the human beings, you could present the prophecies in a somewhat more understandable and more modern language. The old wise of language and writing of Enoch in particular would be almost impossible to understand for most of today's human beings of Earth. This also means that a clear language and explanation is desired, meaning that the prophecies shall not be given in riddles and mysteries, because if I'm to publish everything, then open unriddled, not mysterious. Explanatory and unencoded prophecies would be of value. Because I think that only understandable prophecies can be beneficial. Because with encodings, the interest of the human beings dwindles because they cannot understand anything. My experience proves to me that human beings are much more responsive and make a greater and more interested effort in something when it is explained clearly and distinctly to them. Although it is correct that some anxiety is diminished by encoding prophecies and so forth, however, only to become increasingly greater the less it is understood, because then wild fantasies begin to stir and agitate, wherethrough hellish fears and hellish images arise.
Your words are correct. Therefore, I will present Enoch's prophecies in an understandable form. So then listen.
If the human being of Earth continues to live in the same style as before, if he or she forms his or her thoughts and feelings, likewise, and indulges in the same mode of action as done hitherto, then Henoch's prophecies speak in a clarity of words that could not be any clearer. The point in time at which these prophecies will begin to be fulfilled will be when a pope will no longer reside in Rome. All of Europe will then fall victim to a terrible punishment by evil mights. The Christian religion will collapse, and the churches and monasteries will end up in ruins and ashes. Tremendous forces or powers will be created by the sciences, and will be released by the military and armies as well as by terrorists, wherever a great destruction will occur. Millions and even billions of human beings will be killed through acts of terrorism, through wars and civil wars, and in the end, in some places, every third human being will lose his or her life, and in other places, every fourth human being will lose his or her life. Nations of the East will rise up against nations of the West, and the Western ones against the Eastern ones. Fighter and bomber aircraft will bring many deaths upon the human beings, and bombs and rockets will destroy and eliminate small and large villages and towns. The human beings will be completely mightless against all this, and will live through 888 days of hell on earth, tormented by famine and rampantly spreading diseases, which will claim even more human lives than the war itself. This time will be so hard as it has never before been on earth, because in the end nothing can be bought or sold anymore. All food will be rationed, and if a human being steals even a small piece of bread, he or she will have to pay for it with his or her life. Many waters will mix with human blood and turn red, just as the Nile in Egypt once turned red with blood. And it will be the case that the fanatics of Islam will rise up and cover the nations of Europe with war, wherethrough everything will tremble and quake. Westwards, everything will be destroyed. England will be conquered and thrown onto the lowest level of misery. And the Islam fanatics and Islam warriors will keep their might for a long time. However, all this does not only concern Europe, because ultimately all nations and human beings of Earth will be affected, because all of it expands to a war that will encompass the entire world. After the turn of the millennium, the papacy will continue to exist, only for a short time. Pope John Paul II is the third from last of his office. After him, only one additional pontificate will follow. After that, a Pontifex Maximus comes, who will be called Petrus Romanus. Under his religious rule, the end of the Catholic Church will come. A complete collapse of it becomes unavoidable. That will be the beginning of the worst catastrophe which will have ever befallen the earth and the humankind of Earth. Many Catholic clerics, priests, bishops, cardinals, and many others will be killed, and their blood will flow in streams. But also even the Reformed Christianity will become just as vanishingly small as the Catholic one. Through the guilt of the scientists, the night-greedy ones, and their military, warriors and terrorists will appropriate tremendous might, both through laser weapons of every type, but also through atomic, chemical, and biological weapons. Also, in regard to gene technology, a tremendous misuse will occur, because this will be unrestrainedly exploited for war purposes. Not lastly due to the cloning of human beings for combat, as was practiced in ancient times by the descendants of Henoch in the Sirius regions. However, this will not be all of the horrors, because in addition to the gene technology and the ABC weapons, far worse and more dangerous and more deadly weapons of mass destruction will be produced and will be used. Both the irresponsible politicians who scrupulously exercise their might, as well as the scientists serving them, and the obedient military, will lead a deadly scepter and create cloned individuals who will be bred with complete consciencelessness and scientifically manipulated to become killing machines, who, division by division, devoid of any feelings, destroy, murder, and eliminate everything. It will be with the USA leading the way, together with all the other major Western nations, that will face off against the Eastern countries, although at the same time, they will also have to defend themselves against the Eastern intruders. With all of this, America will play the most decisive role, because under the guise of striving for peace and fighting terrorism, America will invade many nations of the earth, bomb and destroy everything, and bring thousand-fold deaths to the populations. The military policies of the USA will know no limits, nor will its economic and other policies, which will be laid out and directed, as has already been the case for a long time, to build up and wield the might of a world police force. But that will not be all, because in the guise of a so-called peaceful globalization, American politics will aspire to gain absolute world domination in economic form. And this will lead the way to the fact that a third, in fact a fourth, world war could develop therefrom. If the human beings in their entire mass do not finally become rational and undertake the necessary steps against the insane machinations of their governments and military powers, as well as their secret services, and put a stop to the might of the persons in authority and power in all areas. If this does not happen, many great and small nations will lose their independence and their cultural identity and will be devastated and battered down, because the USA, with evil Gavalt, will gain dominance over them and force them under its thumb. At first, many countries will howl with the US wolves, partially due to fear of American aggressions and sanctions, as will also be done by many irresponsible ones in Switzerland and Germany, as well as other nations. But others will join in because they will somehow be forced to do so, or will be led into the unreal by irresponsible ones through American and American-friendly propaganda. However, in the end, many Asian, African, and also European nations will rise up against the American hegemony once they recognize that the United States of America are only taking advantage of them for purposes of war, conquest, and exploitation. Therefore, many countries will initially become vassal states of America, before rationality and cognition find their way into the responsible ones of governments and in many of the population, and a turning away from the USA will be the result. However, the Great War will hardly be avoidable, because the human beings of Earth will probably not find their way to the directives that lead to that which is better, and therewith to true love, to true freedom, and to true peace, because their striving is only directed towards prosperity, pleasure, and wealth, and towards all snatchable material values and vices, and towards unlimited might. Therefore, huge and deadly formations of tanks will roll across the land, while fighter planes and rockets zoom through the air and bring death, ruin, destruction, and elimination on the nations and the human beings. And the terrible time will come when the forces and armies will also get out of control and cause wild and terrible devastation and unimaginable massacres to the human beings, who will mindlessly have to watch the brutal activities. In regard to your and our warnings, the majority of the humankind of Earth will throw caution to the wind. Although some things could still be saved, and the very worst could be averted, if your and our words of love, of peace, of freedom, and of wisdom would be followed. However, unfortunately, precisely this will be questionable. Thus, during the Third, Fourth World War, if it actually comes to this, which, at the moment, and also during the few coming decades, appears to be probable, as calculations and observations indicate, then, as has always been the case, to a tremendously large extent, the civilian population will primarily be the part of the entire catastrophe who will suffer the most. Not lastly, due to the guilt of the irresponsible scientists, who will create human clone combat machines, devoid of conscience and feeling, as well as tremendously deadly and all-destructive computer weapons. In such a case, it is to be feared that the human combat and murder machines, the warrior clones, make themselves independent and will, of their own accord, bring death, devastation, destruction, and elimination over Earth's human beings and over the planet. The whole will become an inferno beyond compare, to such an extent that will have never existed on the Earth up to that time. The cruel and abominable happenings will last about 888 days while civilization collapses. However, the terrible scenario will continue, because rampantly spreading diseases, epidemics, and illnesses of many kinds, as well as tremendous hunger, will spread among the human beings, while the global economy will, completely destroyed, be razed to the ground, and will no longer be able to produce any kinds of goods. Self-evidently, all foods and medicines and so forth will be rationed, and whoever arrogates any of these goods will be punished by death. The insanity of the war not only extends across the nations, because the ruin and depravity will also be spread equally across the oceans and into the atmosphere, even into outer space. But it will also be the case that settlements under the ocean, which will be created in the course of the future, will be attacked and destroyed, claiming the lives of many thousands of human beings. However, a certain maelstrom of destruction will also come from the undersea facilities, because in the cities on the ocean floor, groups of submarine pirates will be formed, who will burst upward from the depths of the ocean and in evil attacks will become embroiled in destructive combat with naval fleets on the surface of the water. And at this time, the possibility can become reality that extraterrestrial powers intervene, which turn against the Western industrialized nations because they will be responsible for the entire tremendous disaster of the coming evil and bad times. If this possibility becomes reality, then these extraterrestrial powers will give up their anonymity and secrecy and help those who are being terrorized by the irresponsibly acting Western nations. However, apocalyptic natural catastrophes will also occur, which will cause all of Europe to shake and tremble. But nevertheless, Europe will continue to exist, even though tremendously many things will have been destroyed. It will look different in the far west, in the United States of America, because it will be a land of total destruction. The causes for this will be manifold, with its global conflicts that are provoked continuously, and which will also continue far into the future. America creates tremendous hatred against the USA in many nations worldwide. As a result, tremendous catastrophes will be in store for America, which will reach proportions that are hardly imaginable for the human beings of Earth. The destruction of the WTC, that is to say, the World Trade Center, by terrorists will only be the beginning. However, all the apocalyptic happenings will be brought about not only due to the use of ABC, laser, and other unbelievably deadly and destructive weapons, and by cloned murder machines, but in addition to this, the earth and nature, which have been maltreated to the deepest depths by the irresponsible human beings of Earth, will rise up and cause destructions as well as bring deaths over the earth, as it could not be worse. Tremendous firestorms and gigantic hurricanes will sweep across the USA and bring devastation, destruction, and elimination, as has never happened before as long as any human being can remember. Not only America, but also all other Western industrial nations, which at the beginning of the new millennium will still live in the delusion that they could dominate and rule over the underdeveloped nations. The third world countries will soon not only lose their influence over these countries, but must also defend themselves against them. In truth, as stated in the Henoch prophecy, the industrial nations are not to be viewed to be true civilizations, but only to be apparent civilizations, because they will trample ever more towards the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the new and third millennium, all true love, the true freedom and wisdom as well as true peace under their feet, along with all values of humaneness and of being a true human being. But all that will not stop the USA from continuing to act against all peoples, even after all the evil happenings. Even if the North American continent will be befallen by the most terrible catastrophe that will ever be recorded there, evil powers of the military will run amok with computer and ABC weapons, while it will also happen that computerized weapons become independent and get out of the control of the human beings. All things considered, this is the most important part of Henoch's prophecies.
But there is still more to explain, if I may kindly ask for it. At least that is what you told me.
You are untiring. Therefore, I will explain a few more important facts from the prophecies.
Already now, certain new rampantly spreading diseases have spread among the human beings of Earth, which, however, as Henoch prophesied, will still be followed by many more. During the 1990s, not only a worldwide spread of AIDS will occur, but also, lasting well into the coming new millennium, rampantly spreading diseases such as the so-called mad cow disease, that is to say BSE, and different strains of Quetzal syndrome resulting from it. However, also a rampantly spreading disease known as Ebola will cause many deaths, as well as other unknown rampantly spreading diseases and illnesses, which will sporadically arise in epidemic proportions and will be new to the human being of Earth and present them with riddles. However, mainly in terms of politics, much terribleness and disaster will occur. Indeed, even before the Third World War will have broken out, France and Spain will engage in armed conflicts against each other. However, France will not only have to carry out warring conflicts against Spain, because, as in Russia and Sweden, there will be great unrest, upheavals, turmoil, tumult, and confusion, etc. within its own country that will bring forth rebellions and civil war. For example, especially in France and Sweden, the machinations of the European Union and its dictatorial edicts will cause much unrest and uprisings. But also the gang-based and organized criminality in the nations mentioned will contribute to civil wars being unavoidable. Additionally, severe differences will arise between native citizens and the immigrants from foreign nations, many of whom, as a rule, also belong to different religious denominations than those of the native populace. And exactly that will also lead to severe conflicts the longer it lasts. Hatred against foreigners, strangers, and religions, and against those who are of a different belief will become the norm, as well as the rise of neo-Nazism, terrorism, and right-wing extremism. Civil war-like conditions will also rule in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and claim many human lives. The Soviet Union will be dissolved in this decade or, at the latest, by the beginning of the next decade. The decisive man for this will be Mikhail Gorbachev. But with that, no calm will come, because the new Russia, as has been the case for a long time, will continue to live with China in a conflict over Inner Mongolia, which will lead to Russia having to relinquish a portion of the territory to China. And precisely, China becomes dangerous, especially for India, with which it does not have the best relationship, even at this time. China will attack India, resulting in around 30 million deaths in the vicinity of New Delhi alone, when biological weapons will be used. However, this will not be enough, because the biological bombs and missiles and so forth that will be used cannot be controlled in their effects at that time, where through terrible, rampantly spreading diseases will come forth that were unknown until then, and will spread at a rampant pace, befalling many areas. Under certain circumstances, also, Pakistan will let itself be fooled into triggering a war against India, which can become especially dangerous in view of the fact that both nations are developing nuclear weapons. However, also, Russia will allow no peace, because it will attack Scandinavia and therewith spread everything to all of Europe. While months before that, a terrible whirlwind will sweep across northern Europe and will cause tremendous devastation and destruction. It must still be stated that the Russian attack will occur in the summertime, namely from Arkhangelsk, while Denmark, however, will not be dragged into the act of war, the reason for which lies in the insignificance of that country. However, Russia will not be satisfied with this act of war, because its will for expansion will be immense. As a consequence, Russia will launch a military attack against Iran and Turkey, and will conquer these two nations in bloody fighting and with tremendous destructions. And the Russian will for expansion. Also, The will to annex the Middle Eastern oil deposits, reserves, as well as reaching directly into the region of southeastern Europe, will be anchored.
Wherefore they push forward into the Balkans, mercilessly and destructively, conquering those nations in enormous battles with many deaths and destructions.
This will then also be the point in time when severe natural catastrophes in Italy will batter the country and its human beings, wherethrough tremendous distress, hardship, and tribulation will ensue. It will also be the time when Vesuvius can open its abyss again and spread tremendous terribleness all around. However, a war will also shake the country and claim many human lives, as well as cause great destructions. Also, war terribleness will descend on the northern nations, because strong military forces from the east will invade, which, murdering and pillaging and threatening to burn, as well as with lots of bomb and rocket volleys and hitherto unknown deadly laser and computer-directed weapons of all types, destroy and eliminate everything. While Hungary will be overrun first, after which Austria and northern Italy will follow. But also Switzerland will be severely affected, however. It will not be the actual target of the attack, because this will be France and also Spain. The overall objective of the aggressors, however, will be to bring all of Europe under their control, namely, a military one, for which France will be selected to be the main seat of power, a nation that will not only be conquered by aggressors from the outside, but also from within, through collaborative powers and other powers. By that it is to be imagined that many foreigners of different beliefs living in France at that time, especially in regard to Islam, will be the inner powers. Once France has fallen, a war of conquest against Spain and England will occur, after which a merging with the aggressive powers that will invade Scandinavia will come about. For all these acts of war coming from France, weapons of mass destruction will be used that are stored there and cause evil devastation, destruction, and elimination. The aggressors from the east will force the French army to join their military forces and lead a war of conquest against the northern nations of Europe, in which case Sweden and Norway are attacked and conquered by them, whereupon these northern nations will be annexed by Russia. Finland will be invaded by military forces, resulting in many deaths and great destructions, after which a complete dissolution of the nation occurs, followed by a prolonged occupation by Russian forces. That will then also be the point in time when German citizens will fight a civil war against each other, and Germany will simultaneously be attacked by a large army from the east. However, the nation and its population will be able to free itself again from the yoke of the aggressors. However, at first, it will come under the default of the invading military forces. After a certain time, the peoples will then rise up against the aggressors and invaders, resulting in a European fight for liberation breaking out. At the same time, when a civil war rages in Germany, in England, it will come to a revolution which will take on a tremendously bloody scale and claim very many victims, who will be counted in a greater number than those victims that will be mourned due to the civil war in Germany. And since England and Ireland have been at war for a very long time already, due to the IRA and England's police and military forces, the result will be, because this feud will continue up to that time, that this whole revolutionary process will also spread to Ireland, especially predominantly affecting Northern Ireland, which, however, under certain circumstances, may spread to the whole country. A great number of deaths will occur during a civil war in Wales, where already, before the Third World War, differences will appear between various parties. Welsh and English forces will clash, especially in the vicinity of Cumra, and claim many deaths and cause enormous destruction. But death, destruction, and elimination will not only cause havoc in Europe, because also America will have to endure much suffering and will have to mourn many deaths, as well as destructions and eliminations. America and Russia, which will have the worst weapons of mass destruction in the world at their disposal, a fact which is already the case today, to a certain extent, will, at that point in time, clash with tremendous might, while Canada will also be dragged into the conflict. The cause of the whole thing will then be based on a Russian attack on the American state of Alaska and against Canada. With this conflict, it will come to mass killings of human beings, as well as to devastating destructions, eliminations, and rampantly spreading diseases, and so forth, as they have never been seen and experienced and lived before by the humankind of Earth. In that case, not only ABC weapons will be used in great amounts, but also tremendously deadly computer-directed weapon systems, which, at the present time, are only in the beginning stages of development, or which will only be invented and constructed in the third millennium. As already mentioned, however, also tremendous natural catastrophes will sweep across the whole of America. While fire rollers and enormous hurricanes will race across the country and bring thousandfold deaths, destruction, and elimination, along with all the terrible effects of the war actions. The largest cities of America will find their absolute destruction, and fire catastrophes will cause much terribleness and bring great misery. Also, mighty earthquakes and volcanic eruptions will belong to that time, and these will also bring much in terms of hardship, deaths, and misery, besides enormous destructions and eliminations, because the entire nature and the planet itself will rise up against the insanity of the human beings of Earth. Tornadoes, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions, however, will not only rage in America, but also in Europe and the rest of the world. These happenings, however, have already begun in the present time, and also during the past decades. Only, they will become increasingly more devastating during the coming times. And for the most part, today as also in the future, the human being of Earth is to blame, who destroys the entire environment, the nature, the atmosphere, the waters, and the resources of the planet. Through that, interterrestrial weight shifts occur. For example, through gigantic water storage reservoirs, and through creating hollow caverns due to the exploitation of petroleum and natural gas from the Earth, and so forth. And therethrough, unnatural inner Earth movements ensue, which also lead to unnatural tectonic effects, and therewith to earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, which in turn also lead to enormous climate changes, resulting in horrendous tornadoes of devastating proportions, which, in the end, will unleash their destructive powers on the entire world. All of this will also lead to increasingly tremendous floods and to unusually massive snowfalls, which will expand into the southern countries, and which will finally extend even to the equatorial regions. Because due to the insanity of the human beings, the Earth has begun to wobble unnoticeably, as a result of atomic bomb explosions inside and on the surface of the Earth. And this will be the reason for the planet to, slowly but surely, take an unusual wobble orbit around the sun, while the first phase is already occurring, where through a climatic change leads to a new ice age. The misery on Earth, however, will continue, because in America, two terrible civil wars will break out, in which case one will occur after the other. After that, the United States of America will break into a deadly hostility amongst themselves, which leads to the American states to split up into 5 different territories, while it cannot be prevented that sectarian fanatics will play a dictatorial role. Anarchy will be a global condition that will prevail for a long period of time, and which will torment the human beings just as much as the many rampantly spreading diseases, illnesses, and epidemics, many of which are new and unknown to the human being, and therefore will also not be curable for him or her. As a result, the bodies of many human beings will slowly and miserably fall apart, while unbearable pain will also occur, as well as blindness and terrible breathing problems, which lead to suffocation. Many human beings will become sick in their consciousness and succumb to imbecility as well as to insanity. And all these gruesome happenings will be the result of biological and chemical weapons, through which, not fast, but gruesome and slow killings of the human beings will occur, as this will also happen through the use of ray weapons and swinging wave weapons, the prototypes of which are already being developed. Finally, the word of Henoch may specifically be mentioned, in which he states that the human being of Earth, as the ancestors of the Henoch lineage have done already, will ignore all values of creation in his or her pursuit of the technology of mass destruction and in his or her greed for might, hatred, vengeance, and riches, and will trample underfoot all love, wisdom, and freedom, and the peace, in order to plunge himself or herself and his/her world into screaming misery, into death, into destruction and elimination, as well as into the greatest catastrophes that the terrestrial humanity will have ever experienced and lived.
But these are still not all the prophecies of Enoch.
That is right. However, the given explanations should suffice.
Just a moment, please, my friend. When you listed Enoch's prophecies, the question came through my head why also Switzerland will actually have to pay, that is to say, will be overrun by foreign war mites. Is there a specific reason for this? As a neutral country, our land should be respected after all and be spared from acts of war.
If Switzerland were to really remain neutral, then it would also be spared from acts of war. Through many irresponsible ones of the people and the government, the land of peace, as it was called in earlier prophecies, will lose its real neutrality, despite different sounding explanations and promises of the irresponsible ones. The fact will be that these irresponsible ones, for which they are already preparing and making efforts today, enter into connections with the UN and NATO as well as with the European Union, which is in the process of forming, wherethrough the real neutrality of Switzerland will be destroyed, namely contrary to all the alternative claims of those responsible in government and the misled population, as I already explained to you. Through the UN and NATO, Switzerland and also its citizens are drawn into acts of war. While the UN is supposed to be of a purely peaceful nature, it will not remain so, because in the new millennium, it will be unavoidable that the UN powers also take to G-Vault with weapons. Even though it may only be for the purpose of defense if necessary, it still means acts of war, through which also in the ranks of the UN powers, death will have a rich harvest. However, that will not be all, because already among various high persons of authority in Europe, the idea has arisen to create a European Union, through which the human beings who belong to it are severely curtailed in their freedom as well as the different state governments, which will sell off their nations entrusted to them to this European Union, which will show very strong dictatorial tendencies. Brussels in Belgium will become the center of government for this union, and the responsible ones there will appropriate tremendous compensations, which will have to be paid by the countries belonging to the union and their populations. They will call these compensations fair remuneration, for which the citizens of all countries belonging to the union will have to work hard by the sweat of their brows. There, through the responsible ones of the European Union, can then live in the lap of luxury at the expense of the citizens and laugh about the dumb height of their supporters. Over time, The governments of the individual countries and the ones of the European Union in Brussels will even go so far as to prosecute and punish their repudiators, complainants, and critics. And the activities of the European Union will finally be the decisive reason that the war powers from the East will attack Europe and destroy and subjugate all, if the entire population of Europe and its governments do not act against it rationally, so that the prophecies will not be fulfilled.
When are these connections with the planned European Union supposed to happen? I mean, in regard to Switzerland.
The rudiments for this will already be set by the responsible ones of the government of Switzerland in the coming 1990s, however. The actual connections will come about only in the next millennium. The irrationality of both the ones in government as well as the majority of the Swiss people will unfortunately be mightier than the rationality will be. And therethrough, all the ways are cleared for the imperiousness of the ones in government, wherethrough finally the catastrophe can descend on Switzerland if the citizens of the country do not still become rational and work against the machinations that lead to servitude and to war. The human beings in the European countries, and therewith also in Switzerland, still have time to prevent everything and turn it around for the better, but it is questionable whether their rationality will win, and they will therethrough prevent the threatening terrible things. Because that is still possible during the next few years, after which, however, it will very quickly become too late.
Rationality is to be hoped for, but I think the hoping will be senseless.
By the looks of it all, you will probably be right.
New translation by Vibke Walder, Australia, Marianne Uelinger, Switzerland, and Bruce Lella, USA.